Welcome everyone. Today we'll be talking about unit testing using Visual Studio Community. The tools that you will need is Visual Studio Community, Microsoft Test, Google Test, and GitHub. We have a few more references than usual, but they are all worth taking a look at. We'll be covering how to create a new solution or use an existing solution with existing projects. We'll be creating a new MST project, new Google test project, and then review both syntaxes. We'll then make a quick review in how to use database context, and lastly, how to set automated tests with triggers using GitHub and YAML. The references that you might need is the MS test framework in unit tests. If you are following the series due to Open3D Engine, it might be a good idea to also test Google Test. That's why we are covering it. We will not be covering Python today. The video will be too long. The documentation for Google Tests using Visual Studio is also available. The official Google Test documentation is available on GitHub. Specifically, how to write value-parameterized tests is of great importance, so we advise you to take a look at that. And we also found some errors using Microsoft Google Tests regarding test suite and test case. It's also worth taking a look at. We also need GitHub, so you need an account in order to do automated tests. You can use whatever you want, Azure or GitHub, but we'll be using GitHub. So we'll start by creating a Microsoft test project. You either create a new solution or you use an existing one. You choose Microsoft Test. Then choose a name. Once the project is done, you can start creating your own tests. To create a Google Test project, you need to first open Visual Studio Installer, press Modify, press Individual Components, and search for Test Adapter for Google Test. Check it and install. Now you can create a new C++ Google Test project. Search for Google Test C++. Don't confuse it with the other C++ test projects like native unit test, unless you want to also try that one as we did. Name it whatever you want. Then in this step we advise to leave it as it is, but the static and dynamic linking to do Google test binaries have the same considerations as any other C++ program. So let's take a look at the differences between the syntax of both Microsoft and Google Test. After you create a Google Test project, this is what you will have inside. You have a test CPP file, which is basically your unit test. You define the test case name and the test name. Notice that the method should always be a test. You then expect to be equal. For example, that example is 1 equals 1, but you can set two different variables. You also have a PCH header, which will include the Google test. This header needs to match the one that you include in your test. You also have the source file called PCH. Just to test if everything is working properly, you rebuild and debug, and it should pop up the console. There is always an error that shows up, and it doesn't stop the project from running, so we left it as it is. We already added a lot of tests, but in your case you should only have one test. If you know how to remove that error, let us know down below in the comments. Now let's compare Microsoft tests with Google tests. Notice that the Microsoft test, you define a new class with test class tag, then you define the method with test method, and you immediately add data rows. In C#, the order of methods does not matter, but in Google Test it does, so you need to take that into account. As an example, the remove duplicates and order by ascending is down below in C#, but in C++ you have to set it first before you call the test method. In Google Test, you define your test method always by defining it as test. The parameters are the case name, followed by the name that will show up in the Test Explorer, which is the unit test name. You do not have data rows out of the box, but you can manually change the inputs as we are showing here. You know that this is not very practical, but it is worth emphasizing that it is possible to do things this way. In terms of asserting if they are equal or not, the syntax is also different. C# uses assert, the other one uses expect. To run a Google test with value parameterized or data rows similar to C#, you need to make a few changes. You need to create a new class. That class must inherit from test with parameters, otherwise it will not work. You then need to use test_p, then you set the case name and the unit test name instead of test. Remember that the unit test must be unique. You cannot repeat the same test name, even if it is in different files. In this case, you need only to change the beginning of your test so you can run it multiple times. Because you have set up test p, you get access to getParam method. Because we define our class inheriting from testing test with param is expecting a tuple, we set an array as input and another integer as the expected result of running the method. Test is just trying to discover if the lowest value is higher than 0. That is not inside the array. Lastly, you populate the input values that the test will execute or run, and the last value is the expected result of the execution that will assert if the method is running properly or not. Given the issue that we found, you should try to instantiate with either test suite or test case. In our tests, we had to use test case using Visual Studio. When comparing both, I find Microsoft a little bit more advanced or more mature than Google Test. This is a personal opinion. I just find it more intuitive than write 3 additional methods when it should be everything compact and be in the same spot. To try to execute the Google Test method, you can set a breakpoint at the end of the method and execute it. You will notice that it will execute the exact same amount of input values that you pass. Since the value parameterized tests are a little bit more complex than Microsoft, we're gonna look at another example. So again, you create a new source file and add a class. That class must inherit from public testing test with parameters. Do not forget to set the input value. In this case, we set it to a simple integer. You also need to include the PCH header so it can include Google Test, otherwise it will also not work. Then you can define your test. Remember, use the test p. The p stands for parameters. Otherwise, if you use only test, you will not get access to getParam. Finally, you instantiate the test with parameters. You either use case or use the suite, depending on your machine or if the issue is solved or not in Microsoft side. The first parameter is a prefix name, then you set the test case name, then you set the input values. In this example, the input values are an array of values. To test it, set a breakpoint, rebuild, debug, and again it will execute the exact same amount of times as the number of inputs in the array. Now let's compare with Microsoft Test or C#. Notice that, again, the input values are set right above the method. You're not writing anything else. You just set the data row and you set the input values. Those input values will pass through the method. Those int v0, v1, v2 are what are coming from the data rows. After the input values enter the method, we create the array. After that, the method is pretty much the same as in Google Test or C++. Now you can debug the Microsoft tests in a similar way as Google tests if you set up the project as the startup. Otherwise, you cannot debug. Or you can debug individually by right-clicking on top of the method and you select debug. This works on both C++ and C#. If you set up the breakpoint at the end, it will execute the exact same amount of times as the number of data rows. In our opinion, Microsoft is a little bit better, not only for beginners but also for maintenance and so on and so forth. I think the least amount of configuration that needs to be done, the better. Now let's check the Visual Studio Community Test Explorer. Notice that you can expand the Test Explorer and the tests and the projects also. It is recognizing both Microsoft and Google tests. You can individually debug each one by right-clicking and pressing debug or execute or run, or you can execute them all at once. The result will appear as a green. If it appears as blue, it means that it was not run, or when you clean the project or rebuild the project, it no longer knows if the test executed correctly or not. If the test fails, it will show in red. Now let's make a quick review about how to test the database context in C# only. It's a different project because we needed a project a little bit bigger, a little bit more mature, and we needed a code first database already created. We advise you to separate the tests into folders because the project starts to expand and you need to organize things properly. If you do that from the beginning, it will make things a little bit easier to find artifacts. Also, if you have, because you are testing a database, or even if it is a test database or a copy of your production database, it might be a good idea to put SQL files inside or scripts so that you can pair both of them with similar names. This will help you greatly to document in both code and reports. Now to execute in C#, notice that we are passing a connection string to a test database. Then we can write code to open the context and check for possible errors. In this case, we are just checking for duplicates inside of the database. This type of approach allows us to open a context and check for possible errors inside the database. We are not really testing the code here, we are testing or verifying if the data is properly set or not. For example, if your context or database was meant to be a classic relational database, then this type of test can check if all rows are unique. If not, then there is an issue. For example, this third-party database does not have all of its rows unique. These type of things can change the direction of the development of your application. You can also make simple searches to the database. For example, one of your users can't find a specific record, and this can help you decipher if the issue is within the database or the data, or the error comes from somewhere else. In our opinion, this approach has a few advantages. It will always leave an unit test behind to showcase some issues, and we try to pair it with both an SQL method or a script and a unit test written in a programming language. Best of our knowledge, there are more advantages to use a programming language to unit test, but sometimes it is considered good practice to check on both because you are testing data, not the logic of your code. Lastly, let's check automated tests with triggers by using GitHub and YAML. Start by opening your GitHub account. Obviously, you need to have project already committed. So you open your repository on GitHub and you press action. Next, you create a new workflow. In our case, we already have one called .NET, and we'll show you how can you set it up. YAML file, you start by giving it a name, then you set the trigger. Every time you make a change on Microsoft test project and you push to the branch, the YAML file can trigger. Then you define the job or task that you're going to do. You define the operating system. You define the action that is available to you. Then you define the project version. This one must match your Microsoft test project. In our case is .NET 7. Then you define which tests you want to run or execute every time the YAML file is triggered. Every time that you make modifications in the Microsoft test project and you push to the master, the trigger will activate and it will run or execute those tests that you have set up. The result of the execution appears in the actions, but remember that it only executes if it is triggered. That's all we wanted to cover for today. We'll see you in the next video.